When you basically run the timeline of the journey from the shooter going all the way from his home into Port Arthur, it just seems like that there are enough odd events along the way for the person to be noticed, for people to notice a person with long blonde hair acting in a strange manner. It does beg the question as to why, if someone wanted to carry out a massacre at Port Arthur, why they wouldn't just drive directly there and begin that process rather than stopping along the way. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. Let's talk about breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs in the sense of a trail that was left behind by the shooter to basically leave some kind of indication that that person was the person who had left their home and gone all the way down through to Port Arthur, where the massacre took place, and then later on to Seascape Cottage, where the siege had taken place. There are a number of witness statements that are basically describing an individual that seemed to fit Martin Bryant's appearance, who had basically had interactions with people then and acted in such a way as to be noticed. These were things like on the way to Port Arthur, the shooter had stopped at a service station and purchased some fuel in some petrol containers and bought a cup of coffee and said that he was going surfing, even though the proprietor felt that was strange because the ocean was flat, there was no surf. Bought a cigarette lighter. The same person later on went to a supermarket and bought a bottle of tomato sauce for no apparent reason and carried in the large bag that was allegedly bought and used and carried the firearms into Port Arthur, and acted in such a suspicious manner as the proprietor of the supermarket was watching them. Bought the bottle of tomato sauce with a whole bunch of coins, just dumped them on the counter. So that was noticed. After that, the shooter had approached a farmer by the name of Roger Larner, who knew Martin Bryant, had known him for quite some time. Roger was down on the driveway of his property when the yellow Volvo pulled up, and the person he got out, he stated in his witness statement, Roger Larner stated he didn't initially recognise him to be Martin Bryant. They had a brief conversation about purchasing some cows for the property, and the person asked if they could go up and see Roger Larner's wife. Roger was a bit uncomfortable with that because he knew that Martin Bryant had had a bit of a fixation with his wife. So he said, no, not at the moment. And the person said, oh, well, I'll come back later, and drove off. The shooter had stopped to assist two young women whose car had broken down by the side of the road on the way to Port Arthur. One of these ladies was Gay Lind, and they had basically stopped because their car had broken down and they were tourists and wanted to get some assistance. And the shooter had pulled up in a yellow Volvo and rendered assistance. He was able to discover that there was a loose wire under the bonnet of the car and basically got the car started, which is unusual in itself because Martin was known for not having a high aptitude for mechanics or electrics or being able to fix anything complex. At the time, the shooter had also asked if the girls had had anything to sell in terms of marijuana. They had a bag of marijuana which he purchased for $50. Martin allegedly had never smoked marijuana, didn't smoke marijuana or smoke cigarettes, yet this shooter had purchased a bag of marijuana for $50. While they were having the conversation, one of the girls had noticed the surfboard on the roof of the Volvo and said, oh, are you going surfing? The shooter had replied, no, I'm going down to the Isle of the Dead to get rid of some wasps, which they thought was quite strange. And he said, you can join me down there and buy me a coffee at the cafe. The shooter then drove off, and the girls, continued on their journey. The next altercation was at the entrance to the toll booth. It was a very crowded day, a lot of tourists there, and there was some queue to get into the site. Apparently, the person in the Volvo was very impatient, trying to get ahead, and was speaking to Stephen Howard at the toll booth entrance and basically remonstrating about being able to get into the site. Martin Bryant had later on stated in his interview with the two police officers that he didn't go down to Port Arthur, hadn't been there in ages, and wouldn't have gone there on the day because of the entrance fee to get into the site. Once he'd managed to get entrance into the Port Arthur site, the next altercation was with Ian Kingston, who was controlling traffic. And the shooter in the Volvo basically approached and said he wanted to park down near the water's edge, and was told, no, you can't park there, we have to reserve that for the buses, in which case he had to drive away and was apparently pretty angry about that. And Ian Kingston went on to continue his duties as a traffic controller for the site. When he looked back, he noticed that the Volvo had been parked down there anyway. He'd been ignored. There was some indication that the initial target was not the cafe, but the ferry that was scheduled to travel to the Isle of the Dead. The Isle of the Dead was a small island which had a cemetery on it, a tourist cemetery which had a lot of historical relevance to the old penal colony at the time. And the ferry was scheduled to basically take people out to that island and drop them off so that they could explore the island. However, due to an unpredicted schedule change, the ferry had left half an hour earlier than scheduled. And there were reports that a young man had basically become fairly upset wanting to get on the ferry and not being able to. That then changed the trajectory of that person to then enter the Broad Arrow Cafe where the main shooting occurred. Once inside the cafe, the shooter had basically gone and purchased a meal at the servery and sat down at the table. He had gone into the cafe carrying a large bag and a grey camera bag, a video camera bag, and basically had some trouble getting through the doors. One of the witnesses had stated they'd opened the door to allow him to get through. He sat down, had his meal, ate in a very, rushed way, and witnesses were stating that he seemed agitated and anxious, and at one point was waving his arms around his head and complaining about wasps, and said words to the effect of a lot of wasps around nowadays, not too many Jap tourists. So people noticed this behaviour and thought it was quite odd, and then the shooting took place. So when you basically run the timeline of the journey from the shooter going all the way from his home into Port Arthur, it just seems like that there are enough odd events along the way for the person to be noticed, for people to notice a person with long blonde hair acting in a strange manner. It does beg the question as to why, if someone wanted to carry out a massacre at Port Arthur, why they wouldn't just drive directly there and begin that process rather than stopping along the way. But once again, because of the identity of the person in the Volvo, was never really comprehensively proven, even given the notion that a lot of people who knew Martin Bryant, had known him since he was young, didn't initially recognise him. Roger Lana didn't initially recognise him. Jim Laycock, who knew him from an early age, didn't recognise him, neither did Wendy Skua. A lot of people, most of the witnesses, saw a person in a long dark coat and long blonde hair. There were varying descriptions of a different type of hairstyle, Some witnesses stated that the shooter had a pockmarked, acne-scarred face and worker's hands, whereas Martin Bryant was known to have very smooth skin and very wavy hair. But this person acted in such a manner as to create suspicion and create telling trail of breadcrumbs, if you like. But breadcrumbs don't necessarily prove the identity of who that person was. Only DNA and confirmed hard evidence would do that. As an aside to that, when I was filming the teaser trailer for the intended film that we want to do on Port Arthur, I deliberately used 3 different people to play Martin Bryant in the trailer. One of them was obviously wearing a wig, and nobody initially noticed. All they saw was a person with long blonde hair. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. Feel free to share far and wide and see the attached files in support of the episode. Thank you.